It was a slow morning in Alabama, the kind that carried heat even before the sun climbed high. A weight in the air that made the fields shimmer like something alive. The plantation spread wide and quiet, rows of cotton whispering softly under the wind, and at the heart of it all stood the Caldwell house, a grand white structure that looked calm and proud from a distance but hid things that breathed in its walls, things that hummed under its polished floors, things that waited for the right hour to be heard. Thomas Caldwell walked out on the porch that morning with the same pride he had carried every day since his father left him the land. He believed order was his gift to the world, that every blade of grass bent because he willed it to, and that silence among his workers meant peace. But that morning it was not peace that lived in the silence. It was fear mixed with gossip, thick as smoke. Curling under the hot air, the slaves in the fields kept their heads down, their hands working, but their eyes flicked to one another, to the window on the east side of the big house where the curtain had moved just before dawn. A few had seen it, the shape of a woman leaning out, pale against the dark inside, her hair loose when it shouldn't be, her hand trembling as if reaching for someone who never came. They didn't speak of it, not loudly at least. Not where the master might hear, but the whisper began small, like the rustle of dry grass before the fire starts. And by mid-morning, everyone had heard it. The mistress, Evelyn Caldwell, had been seen near the stables long after the candles were blown out, her soft steps in the dirt, her gown dragging behind her, a man's shadow beside hers, and the echo of laughter that didn't belong to her husband. Inside the house, the air was cooler but no less heavy. The scent of rose water clung to every hallway. Evelyn moved through it like a ghost pretending to be alive, her hands touching the furniture as if she were afraid it might vanish. She was beautiful in a way that hurt the eyes, not for her looks but for the sadness that hid behind them. A beauty that was meant for cities, not soil, for ballrooms, not barns, and everyone knew she was too restless for this land, too wild to be tamed by a man like Thomas, yet she played her part, smiling when guests visited, hosting Sunday dinners, singing softly to the piano when the nights were long. But the servants noticed when her songs changed, when they turned from hymns to something softer, sadder, something that sounded like a woman who wanted to be anywhere but here. Thomas, on the other hand, saw only what he wanted to. He believed his wife was loyal because loyalty was something he demanded from everyone, and the thought of betrayal had no place in his perfect order. He had built his world like a fence, neat, measured, strong, but fences do not stop whispers, and whispers have a way of crawling through cracks no one sees. Samuel, the oldest hand on the plantation, was the first to hear it clearly. Late one night when he went to check the horses, he had seen the stable door open slightly, a lantern swinging faintly inside, and a woman's voice whispering a name he didn't know. His chest tightened, not because of what he saw, but because he knew what would come if Thomas ever found out. The next morning when Samuel passed the kitchen, the younger maid, Clara, whispered to him, her eyes wide. She said she'd seen the mistress again, walking barefoot past the garden, the hem of her gown wet from the grass. She didn't look lost, Clara said. She looked alive, and that scared her more. Samuel told her to hush. Told her the master's ears were sharp, but it was already too late. Words once spoken cannot be buried. They travel faster than wind, through doors, through prayers, through silence. And by the time the sun fell that day, the whole house seemed to hum with the rumor. Evelyn sat by her mirror that night, brushing her hair in long, slow strokes. Outside her window, the crickets sang and the moon hung heavy over the fields. She looked at her reflection as if trying to recognize the woman staring back. The mistress of the Caldwell plantation, wife to a man who owned everything but her heart. She whispered something under her breath, a name perhaps, or a prayer, and her eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. She closed her eyes and listened, and somewhere beyond the trees a horse neighed softly. A faint signal. She rose quietly, her white nightdress catching the moonlight, and slipped out of the room, her bare feet silent against the floorboards. In the quarters beyond the field, Samuel sat awake by his small window. He could see the path to the stable, a shadow moving against the night. His breath caught when he realized it was her again, her form graceful and hurried, and then another shadow followed. Taller, broader, a man. He couldn't see the face, only the shape of hands meeting in the dark. The sound of soft laughter carried by the wind, a sound that did not belong in a place built on pain. He turned his head away, but he could not unsee it, nor could he sleep, because every sound that followed, the creak of the barn door, the low murmur, the faint cry that might have been a name, pressed against his chest like a secret trying to escape. When dawn came, Samuel went about his chores with heavy silence. Thomas greeted him as usual, not noticing the unease in his eyes. Or maybe he did, but pride made him ignore it. Pride can make a man blind even when truth stands in front of him. He walked to the field, inspecting the rows, his boots leaving deep prints in the wet earth, and every worker bowed their head lower than usual. Every glance was shorter, every breath careful, because the whispers had grown teeth now, and fear had begun to take shape. By noon, the sky turned gray, the kind of gray that pressed down like judgment. Evelyn sat at the piano playing a slow tune, something soft and strange, the notes trembling like her hands. Thomas stood behind her for a moment, listening, his face unreadable when she finished. He said nothing, just walked away. She looked after him, her eyes distant, as if she knew the silence between them was no longer safety. But warning that evening in the kitchen, Clara whispered again, this time to Grace, the cook. She said the master had asked Samuel about the stables, that he had found footprints there, small and bare beside the horse prints. Grace hushed her, told her to keep her tongue still before it got someone killed. But Clara shook her head, saying it didn't matter now, because the master had gone quiet. And when Thomas Caldwell went quiet, something terrible always followed. Night came heavy that day, darker than usual. Thunder growled far off, as if the heavens themselves knew what waited. Samuel couldn't sleep, his conscience twisting inside him. He had thought of speaking to Evelyn, warning her, but fear stopped him. Fear of Thomas, fear of the lash, fear of what truth can do when spoken too loud. Yet silence was no safer. He felt it deep down, like the air before lightning strikes. Charged and ready to burn in her room, Evelyn paced, her fingers clutching her gown. She could feel eyes watching her even when none were there. The walls seemed to whisper now. Her own reflection seemed to accuse her. She thought of the man she met in the stables, Jacob. Young, foolish, gentle, he had promised her love, something simple and free, and she had believed him because she wanted to believe someone. Anyone would see her as more than a wife trapped in silk. But now she understood what she had risked, what she had awakened. She looked toward the door, half expecting it to open, half dreading that it would. Thomas sat alone in his study, the candle burning low. The paper before him untouched, he stared at the flame, at the way it bent when the wind touched it. He thought of his father, of discipline, of respect, of how weakness destroyed families, and his hands clenched, somewhere deep inside. He already knew the truth. He had seen her distant eyes, her cold touch, her sudden laughter at nothing. But knowing and admitting were two different things, and Thomas Caldwell was not a man who admitted anything easily, not to others, not to himself. When the rain finally came, it fell hard, drumming against the roof, washing the dust from the fields, and with it came the sound of a single horse running through the mud. Fast, desperate, Thomas rose from his chair, moving to the window but saw nothing in the darkness. Still, the noise echoed in his mind, and sleep never found him that night. By morning, the sky cleared bright and cruel. The field steamed under the sun. The air smelled of wet earth and secrets. Thomas walked down to the stables, his boots sinking into the soft ground. The horses shifted restlessly, their eyes wide, and on the ground near the door he saw it. A single gold button, small, polished, but not one of his. He picked it up, held it against his palm, and for the first time in years he felt his hands tremble. He slipped it into his pocket and said nothing. That day the plantation moved slower, as if time itself hesitated. The workers looked at Thomas from a distance, their faces careful masks, and Evelyn moved through the halls like a shadow, her eyes darting to every corner. She could feel something tightening around her, unseen but closing in by sunset. The whispers were no longer whispers, they were warnings. Samuel heard them in every breath of wind, in every creak of the wood, in every prayer muttered under trembling lips. Something was coming and none could stop it now. When night fell again, the moon rose bright and sharp, cutting through the clouds like a blade. Evelyn sat by the window, staring at the fields. She could see the lanterns moving in the distance, small flickers of life, and she wondered if any of those people pitied her, or if they only waited to see what would happen when her secret reached the master's ear. She turned away and whispered Jacob's name one last time, as if saying it might keep him safe. Outside, Thomas stood on the porch, the button still in his pocket, his jaw tight, the world around him silent except for the sound of frogs near the pond. And then he heard it. A faint laugh carried on the night breeze. Familiar, wrong. It came from the direction of the stables. His eyes narrowed, his heart slow and heavy. He started walking, each step deliberate, each breath colder than the one before. In the field, Samuel watched from afar, his stomach twisting. He saw the lantern moving through the dark, saw the master's shadow stretching long across the wet ground. He wanted to look away, to hide, but some dark pull kept him there, and when the door of the stable creaked open and Thomas stepped inside, the wind seemed to die, the cricket stopped. Even the night held its breath. What happened next, no one could say for sure. Only that there was shouting, then silence. A sound that cracked like thunder. And when dawn came again, the house was quiet, the field still, and every soul on the plantation felt the weight of what had been uncovered. The whispers had stopped at last, but the fear had only begun, for the truth once seen can never be unseen. And in Alabama that summer of 1840, the Caldwell plantation began to rot from the inside, one secret at a time. The storm rolled in before midnight, crawling over the Alabama sky like a living thing, thunder rumbling deep in the earth as rain poured heavy over the fields. The air smelled of wet soil and something else, something bitter, something that burned inside the chest of anyone who dared breathe too deeply. Inside the grand house, Evelyn Caldwell stood by the window, her hands trembling as lightning painted the horizon white. She told herself it was only rain, only wind, only fear playing its cruel tricks. But her reflection in the glass seemed to whisper otherwise. The glass showed her pale and haunted, eyes hollow, lips pressed tight as if holding back a confession the night would soon force from her. Downstairs the lamps flickered. The storm had frightened the horses, and the stable boy Jacob had gone out to calm them. Evelyn knew he was out there. She could almost hear his voice under the rain, soft calling to the horses, gentle like always, and her heart twisted painfully because she wanted to see him, to hold on to something real before the world fell apart. She moved quietly through the dark hallway, her gown brushing against the floor. Every creak in the wood sounded like a warning. Every shadow seemed to lean closer. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. She clutched the candle tighter and made her way down the back steps. The house behind her groaned under the storm, but she did not look back. The cold air hit her face as she stepped outside, rain soaking her dress, but she didn't care. She followed the narrow path that led to the stable, her bare feet splashing through the mud, her breath shaking with every step. Inside the stable, Jacob worked quickly, throwing dry hay to the frightened horses. Whispering calm words, his shirt clung to his skin, his hands rough and steady. When he saw her figure at the door, his eyes widened, fear and longing crossing his face all at once. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his voice barely a whisper, but she only shook her head, water dripping from her hair. "I had to see you," she said, her voice soft, almost lost under the roar of rain on the roof. He stepped closer, his hand brushing her cheek. For a moment the world outside vanished. The storm, the fields, the eyes that might be watching, all disappeared in the warmth between them. But in the dark corner of the barn, unseen, another pair of eyes watched. Samuel had come again to check the horses, his lantern left outside the door. He stood frozen in the shadows, his heart pounding as he saw them together, their hands touching, their faces inches apart. He knew then what would come, what kind of wrath Thomas Caldwell would unleash if he ever learned the truth. Samuel wanted to step back, to slip away before he saw more, but the old boards beneath his foot gave a soft groan, and Evelyn turned her head sharply, her eyes wide with terror. For a heartbeat, the three of them stared at one another, rain hammering the roof like drums of war. Then Samuel whispered, "Mistress, go back. Please." His voice shaking. He didn't want to see her destroyed. He didn't want blood on the ground where he worked every day. But Jacob stepped forward, anger flashing in his eyes. "You don't speak of this," he said, his voice trembling not with courage but with fear. "You say nothing." Samuel looked at him with pity. "You don't understand, boy," he whispered. "The master always knows." Evelyn grabbed Jacob's hand, her voice desperate. "Please, Samuel, you never saw us." No one will know, but Samuel knew better. Secrets on the Caldwell plantation didn't stay buried long. They rose up from the dirt. They found their way into the master's dreams outside. The thunder cracked so loud the horses reared and screamed. Jacob rushed to calm them. Evelyn pressed a hand to her chest, her heart racing so fast she thought it might burst. She looked at Samuel with pleading eyes, but he turned away, his face heavy with sorrow. He left the stable without another word. The rain swallowing his footsteps, Evelyn clung to Jacob, tears mixing with the rain on her face. "He'll tell him," she whispered. Jacob shook his head. "No, he won't." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. In the big house, Thomas sat awake, staring at the candle flame on his desk. Something inside him restless, wrong. He didn't know why he couldn't sleep. Maybe it was the storm. Maybe it was the silence of a wife who had stopped loving him long ago. Or maybe it was that strange pull in his chest, that voice that told him to look out the window. And when he did, through the rain and lightning, he saw it, the faint flicker of movement by the stable. Two shapes, close, too close. He rose slowly, the floorboards groaning under his boots. He didn't take a lantern. He didn't call for anyone. He simply walked out into the storm, the rain hitting his face like cold knives, every step sinking into mud, the wind howling in his ears. But his mind clearer than it had been in months. The truth he had refused to see now burning in his chest. In the stable, Jacob held Evelyn close, whispering that everything would be all right. But his words died when the door burst open, lightning flashing behind the tall figure of Thomas Caldwell. The master stood in the doorway, soaked to the bone, eyes hollow and blazing at once, his silence heavier than thunder. Evelyn froze. Jacob stepped forward, trying to speak, but Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. He simply looked at them, and in that look was every storm Alabama had ever known. No one spoke. The only sound was the rain on the roof and the ragged breathing of three people who knew the world had just broken. Evelyn tried to speak, to explain, but her throat locked. Jacob reached for her, but Thomas raised his hand and he stopped, not by command but by the sheer weight of the man's presence. "Go to the house," Thomas said finally, his voice low and empty. Evelyn hesitated, her legs shaking. "Go," he repeated, softer this time but colder. She walked past him into the rain, her tears lost in the storm. Jacob stood still, trembling. Thomas looked at him for a long time, then turned away, walking out into the night without another word. Evelyn reached the porch, her dress clinging to her skin. She sank to her knees, sobbing. Lightning flashed again, and in that moment she thought she saw something in the window above her, the shadow of her husband watching. But when she looked again, it was gone. The storm raged until dawn, and when the sun finally rose, the plantation was silent. The workers moved like ghosts, afraid to speak, afraid to breathe. Everyone knew the master had learned the truth. They could feel it in the air, heavy, thick, deadly. Samuel kept his head down that morning, guilt pressing on his back like a chain. He wanted to leave, to run, but there was nowhere to go. He saw Evelyn through the window, pale and hollow, her hair undone, her eyes red from crying, and behind her in the same room, Thomas sat in silence, his face calm but his hands clenched so tight his knuckles were white. He said nothing all day, not to his wife, not to the servants. But when the sun began to fall, he sent word through Grace, telling everyone to gather in the courtyard by nightfall. The tone of his voice made her tremble. She didn't ask why, she didn't need to. When the evening came, the plantation gathered under the orange glow of torches, the sky still heavy with storm clouds. Evelyn stood on the porch beside her husband, her eyes fixed on the ground. Thomas looked at the faces before him, the workers, the servants, Samuel, Jacob, even the children. The world seemed to hold its breath. "There is sickness in this house," Thomas said quietly, his voice cutting through the air like the crack of a whip. "And tonight, we will cure it." The people didn't understand what he meant, not yet, but they knew enough to be afraid. The horses whinnied in their stalls. The wind hissed through the trees, and Evelyn felt the ground sway beneath her feet. She wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, but her throat refused to move. The night had swallowed her voice. Thomas turned his eyes on her, slow and unblinking, and for a moment she saw not anger but something worse, calm, cold calm, the kind that came before something unforgivable. Later, when the torches burned low and the crowd began to whisper, when the children were sent away and the air grew heavy with dread, Samuel looked at the master and saw something he had never seen before. Not cruelty, not rage, but loss, the kind of loss that hollowed a man out and left nothing but vengeance to fill the space. And when Thomas finally spoke again, his words cut through the dark like knives. "Tomorrow," he said, "the world will see what betrayal looks like." And as the crowd dispersed into the shadows, no one dared to ask what he meant because deep inside they already knew. And in the stillness that followed, the Caldwell plantation waited for the dawn that would change it forever, a dawn that would burn away every lie, every whisper, and leave only ashes behind. The morning after the storm came too soon. The light outside the Caldwell house was pale and washed out, like the sun itself was afraid to shine on what had been done. The fields glistened under a layer of mist, the air heavy and still. No birds sang, no laughter carried from the quarters. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath inside the house. Everything was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Evelyn sat at the dining table dressed in white, her hair neatly pinned, her hands trembling just slightly as she lifted the cup of coffee to her lips. She hadn't slept. Her eyes were hollow, her mind still echoing with thunder and her husband's voice from the night before. Across from her sat Thomas, calm, unmoving. A newspaper folded in his hands, though his eyes never read a word of it. He just stared through the pages as if they were glass, his jaw tight, his silence louder than any scream. The servants moved like shadows, quiet, fearful. No one dared to look directly at him. Grace placed the biscuits on the table, her hands shaking so bad one almost slipped. But Thomas didn't notice. Or maybe he did and simply didn't care. Evelyn tried to speak, to find words that could still hold meaning. "Thomas," she said softly, her voice cracking like old wood. "Please, listen to me." But he didn't look up. He just turned the page, the sound of paper tearing slightly under his grip. "There's nothing to listen to," he said, his tone flat, empty, like a man who had buried his soul and was now speaking from the grave. The silence that followed was unbearable. Evelyn's fingers tightened around her cup until it cracked. The hot liquid spilling onto her hand, she didn't flinch. She just stared at him, her lips trembling. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I made a mistake." But Thomas raised his hand and the words died in her throat. His eyes finally met hers, and she wished they hadn't, because what she saw there was worse than rage, worse than hate. It was disappointment, deep, endless disappointment that made her feel smaller than the chair she sat in. "Do you think mistakes wash away with tears?" he asked quietly. "Do you think the world forgets what it sees?" His voice was calm but cold enough to freeze blood. He stood slowly, folding the newspaper with precision, his movements steady, controlled. "There will be no shouting," he said, "no drama, no running." He looked toward the window where the gray light poured in. "We will have peace in this house again." Evelyn blinked, confused, her voice small. "Peace?" she repeated, "after what you saw?" But he didn't answer. He walked past her, his boots echoing against the floor. The sound of finality in every step. She turned to follow him, her hands shaking. "Thomas, please don't do this," she said. But he didn't stop, didn't turn. He only said, "Be ready by sunset." The words sank into her like knives. She didn't know what he meant, but deep down she feared she already did. She stood there long after he left, staring at the window, the fields outside glowing gold under the thin sun, and she thought of running. She thought of taking a horse and disappearing down the long dirt road toward town. But she knew he would find her. Thomas always found what was his, and in his eyes she was still his, even now. Especially now outside, Samuel worked in silence, his back aching, his heart heavier than the tools he carried. He had seen the look in the master's eyes that morning when he walked past the field. He didn't speak to anyone, not even to Grace, who caught his arm and whispered, "He's planning something," but Samuel just nodded. His eyes down. "He already planned it," he said softly. Last night, Grace's lips trembled. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words refused to come, because deep down, everyone on that land felt it, like the pressure in the air before a storm. Something was about to break. By afternoon, the heat returned, heavy and wet, the kind of heat that made the air shimmer and thoughts blur. Evelyn walked through the halls, her footsteps slow, her hand brushing the walls like she needed to remember the feel of the house that had been her prison and her palace, her dream and her doom. She paused at every doorway, at every picture, every candle, every silent reminder of the life she had built from lies. She heard faint laughter from outside, the workers speaking low among themselves. But when she looked out the window, the sound stopped, as if her gaze alone could choke the air. Thomas spent the afternoon in his study, the door closed. His voice heard only once when he called Samuel in. No one knew what was said. Samuel came out pale, sweat shining on his forehead. He didn't speak a word for the rest of the day. When Grace asked him what the master had told him, he only muttered. He said, "Tell everyone to come to the courtyard before dark." Then he walked away, his steps slow like a man heading to his own hanging. As the sun began to fall, painting the sky orange and red, the plantation took on a strange quiet, the kind of stillness that made even the insects silent. Evelyn stood in front of her mirror again, the same one from every night she had whispered her secret prayers into. She touched her face, her skin pale under the dying light. She whispered Jacob's name once softly, like a ghost might whisper to another ghost. She didn't know if he was still alive. Thomas had said nothing about him, and that silence was worse than any confession. She wanted to cry, but her tears had dried somewhere between fear and regret. Outside, torches were being lit, the flames swaying in the growing dark, the air filled with the smell of smoke and rain-soaked earth. People began to gather slowly, One by one, their faces tense, their eyes wide. Thomas stood on the porch in his dark coat, his presence heavy as the storm clouds above. Beside him stood Evelyn, her hands clasped together, her dress the color of ivory. Glowing faintly in the firelight, Thomas didn't look at her, his gaze fixed on the crowd forming below. Samuel stood at the edge, watching, his stomach turning. He wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't move. Grace stood beside him, whispering prayers under her breath. The torches crackled, the night deepened. Thomas raised his hand and the murmurs stopped. The silence that fell was absolute, the air thick enough to choke on. This house, he began, his voice deep and measured, was built on discipline, on order, on truth. His eyes scanned the faces before him, the fire reflecting in his dark pupils. But truth has been broken. Order has been stained. He turned his head slowly toward Evelyn, who kept her eyes on the ground, her body trembling. And tonight, he said, we begin to make it whole again. A murmur ran through the crowd. Confused, afraid, Thomas looked back at them, his tone colder now. You have served this land. You have seen what happens when lies take root, he paused, his hand resting on the railing. So tonight, you will see what happens when they are torn out by the root. Evelyn's breath caught, her knees almost giving way. Thomas turned to her then, his voice dropping low. Do you have anything to say? She looked at him, her lips parting, but no sound came, not even a sob. The silence stretched until it hurt, until even the torches seemed to flicker quieter. Thomas turned back to the crowd, his face calm, unreadable. Tomorrow, he said slowly, there will be no whispers left on this land. He stepped down from the porch, the firelight painting his face in red and gold. And as he walked through the crowd, people stepped aside like the wind itself was parting them. Evelyn watched him go, her heart breaking with each step. She wanted to call out, to beg, to fall to her knees, but her voice had left her. She stood frozen as he disappeared into the shadows beyond the torches. When the night grew thick and the stars vanished behind clouds, the crowd began to drift away. Samuel lingered a moment longer, staring at the porch where Evelyn still stood, her figure pale, her eyes empty. Then he turned to Grace and whispered, Tomorrow, nothing will ever be the same, she nodded, tears on her cheeks. The reckoning's coming, she said, and the two walked back toward the quarters, the sound of their footsteps lost in the wind. Inside the house, Evelyn moved like a ghost, the hallways darker than ever. She felt the cold even though the night was warm. She touched the wall where her wedding portrait once hung. Now gone, removed by unseen hands, her breath shook. She reached her room, closed the door, and sank to the floor outside. Thunder rolled again far in the distance, faint but growing, as if the storm had been waiting for this moment. The calm before it tore the world apart, and as the first drops of rain began to fall once more, Evelyn Caldwell whispered a prayer she knew would never be heard, because the house itself was listening, and the walls of the Caldwell plantation had already chosen their side. The next day rose without a sound. The sky hung low and gray like wet linen stretched across the heavens. Even the wind refused to move. The plantation lay heavy under its own silence, a silence thick enough to choke, a silence that seemed to be waiting for something terrible to begin. Thomas Caldwell stood on his porch just after dawn, his hands clasped behind his back, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the fields met the trees. His face calm but his mind a storm of its own. He hadn't slept. The candle in his study had burned through the night, melting down into nothing, but he didn't feel tired. Something inside him felt more awake than ever, a cold kind of awake that made every thought sharp, every sound clear. The world had betrayed him. His home had betrayed him, and yet he looked upon it all with an eerie calm, as though he were looking at the grave of something he had loved once but could not forgive. Inside, Evelyn lay on her bed staring at the ceiling. The white fabric above her looked like fog, soft but suffocating. She hadn't moved for hours, hadn't eaten, hadn't spoken. Her hands clutched the bedsheet tightly, her nails pressing into the fabric. The words Thomas spoke last night echoed inside her skull like church bells. Tomorrow there will be no whispers left on this land. The meaning of it clawed at her. What would he do? What had he already done? She tried to pray, but her lips only trembled. She could feel the house breathing around her, the faint creak of floorboards, the whisper of curtains moving without wind. It was as if the walls themselves knew what was coming and were mourning it. By midday, the servants began to move faster than usual. The air felt restless. Grace stood in the kitchen whispering orders no one wanted to follow, her voice shaky but firm. Master wants food for the evening, she said. Meat, bread, wine. The younger maids stared at her wide-eyed. "What's it for?" one asked. Grace hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. "He said he's holding a gathering." The word tasted bitter as it left her mouth. It didn't sound like celebration, it sounded like sentence. In the field, Samuel worked quietly, but every swing of his hoe felt heavier. The memory of the storm of the stable, of the look on the master's face, all played behind his eyes. He knew Thomas Caldwell was a man who could forgive almost anything except shame. And this wasn't just betrayal of love. It was betrayal of pride. Pride that fed him, ruled him, defined him. Samuel looked up toward the house and saw Thomas standing near the edge of the porch again, still as a statue, the sun lighting his face like gold over stone. Something about that stillness frightened Samuel more than anger ever could. The afternoon dragged on slow and cruel. The air thick with humidity, the fields buzzing with flies. Every worker kept glancing toward the big house, waiting, counting hours they couldn't name. Evelyn finally rose from her bed, her body trembling from exhaustion. She walked to the window and looked out. The field seemed endless, the sky pale, the people small like ants moving in endless circles. She pressed her hand against the glass. She wanted to scream, to run, to tell someone, but no one would help her now. She had crossed a line no one returned from. As the sun began to lower, painting the horizon red like blood spilled across the sky, Thomas spoke again, his voice carrying across the land through Samuel, through Grace, through every trembling lip that passed the message along. All must come to the courtyard when the sun is gone. No explanation followed, only command, and command was enough. As the light faded, the plantation began to stir, people walking slowly from the quarters, their eyes full of dread, children clinging to their mothers, old men whispering prayers no one dared refuse. Evelyn dressed slowly in silence, her fingers shaking as she tied the ribbons on her gown. She chose white again, not out of vanity, but out of something else, something strange, as if she knew she was dressing not for a dinner but for judgment. She looked at herself in the mirror one last time, her reflection pale, her eyes distant. "You deserve this," she whispered to herself, though she didn't know if she believed it. She walked down the stairs with slow, careful steps, the echo of her heels sounding like a clock counting down. Outside, torches were lit, the flames flickering against the night, long shadows stretching across the yard. The courtyard filled slowly, faces appearing out of the dark. The air smelled of smoke and fear. The trees around them swayed gently, their branches like arms reaching down to watch. Thomas appeared from the doorway dressed in black, his expression calm. Too calm. Beside him stood Evelyn, her hands clasped tight, her face pale under the orange light. He didn't look at her, not once. He stood tall before the gathered crowd and spoke in a voice that rolled across the night like thunder. "This land was built on faith," he said, "on loyalty, on truth." He paused, his eyes sweeping across the faces below. "And yet even the strongest foundation can rot from within." The crowd stood silent. The flames crackled. The night hummed low. "For years I have given my labor, my heart, my life to this soil." His voice grew sharper. "And in return, it has given me betrayal." Evelyn flinched but said nothing. The words cut deep. "But tonight," Thomas continued, "this land will be cleansed of lies." A murmur spread through the people. Soft, fearful, no one knew what he meant. Samuel's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at Evelyn, her face frozen like porcelain, then back at the master, who stepped down from the porch and motioned for Samuel to come forward. The old man hesitated, his throat dry. "You were there," Thomas said, his tone calm but deadly. "You saw, didn't you?" Samuel froze, his mind racing. Every word a risk, he nodded slowly. "Yes, sir," he whispered, his voice barely holding. "I saw." Thomas's gaze never wavered. "Then tell them," he said. "Tell them what you saw." The crowd turned toward Samuel. The night seemed to hold its breath. Samuel swallowed, his voice trembling as he spoke. "I saw the mistress," he began, "in the stables, with Jacob." A gasp rippled through the group. Some stepped back, others covered their mouths. Evelyn closed her eyes, tears finally falling. Thomas didn't move, didn't blink. "Tell them more," he said. "Tell them what she did." Samuel's lips shook. They held each other," he whispered. "They spoke soft like lovers." His words trailed off into the silence. Thomas turned to the crowd again, his face unreadable. "And what should be done with betrayal?" he asked, his voice cold as the wind sweeping through the trees. No one answered, no one dared. The fire cracked. sparks rising into the dark sky. You have all felt betrayal in your lives, he continued. You know its sting, you know its rot. He pointed toward Evelyn. His hand steady. She betrayed this house, this land, and me. His tone lowered. So tonight, it is not I who will decide her fate, it will be you. The crowd froze, disbelief spreading across their faces. Evelyn's breath caught. No, she whispered, her voice weak. Thomas, please. He didn't look at her. If this house belongs to all who work it, then let all see justice done. The silence that followed was unbearable. Some of the women began to cry softly. Grace covered her mouth with her apron. The flames flickered against Evelyn's pale face, her eyes wide with terror. Samuel's stomach turned. He couldn't move. He wanted to speak, but words failed him. Thomas stepped back, folding his hands behind him, his shadow long and dark against the ground. Do what you must, he said quietly. Let the land decide, and with that, he turned and walked away toward the porch, leaving Evelyn standing alone in front of everyone she had once commanded, her body trembling, her tears shining under the firelight. For a long moment, no one moved, no one spoke. Then Grace stepped forward slowly, her voice low but steady. We won't kill her, she said. We're not the ones who take life. The others nodded faintly, still unsure. Samuel joined her, his voice breaking. No killing, he whispered. But she must feel what she made others feel. The crowd began to circle slowly, the air thick with fear. Evelyn looked around at the faces she had once ruled over. Faces now filled with pain, pity, and something else, something deeper. The reflection of years of suffering turned back at her. She fell to her knees, sobbing. I'm sorry, she cried. I never meant. But her words drowned under the sound of the wind. Thomas watched from the porch, his eyes shadowed, his expression cold. He didn't move, didn't speak. He just stared as the torches flickered and the people turned away from her one by one. A silent sentence passed without a word. Evelyn's cries echoed through the night, fading slowly as the flames dimmed, and by the time the last torch burned low, the Caldwell plantation had gone still again, silent, heavy, haunted, and up in the distance. Where the trees bent toward the field, the first whisper of thunder rolled across the horizon once more, low and distant, as though the storm that had started it all wasn't done yet. It was only waiting to come back and finish what men had begun. The night after the gathering felt endless. The air around the Caldwell plantation carried a strange kind of stillness, like the earth itself had stopped breathing. The torches were gone, their ashes cold and scattered, but the smell of smoke still clung to the wind. Heavy, bitter, and unforgettable, the people had gone back to their quarters, but no one slept. Some whispered prayers. Others just sat staring at their hands as if afraid to look up, because the image of what they had seen, the sight of the mistress on her knees under the firelight, her husband watching from the porch, her cries lost in the wind, that image had burned itself into every mind, and though Thomas Caldwell had said nothing more, they all knew this was only the beginning. Inside the great house, the halls were darker than usual, the candles unlit, the rooms cold. Evelyn sat on the floor of her room, her dress torn and stained from the night before, her eyes red and hollow. She had tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw faces of those she once commanded, faces that now looked at her with judgment instead of fear. She pressed her hands to her ears, but she could still hear the wind outside, whispering words she couldn't understand, words that sounded like prayers and curses all at once. She wanted to run, to disappear, to wake up in another life. But every time she tried to move, her body felt too heavy, as if the house itself was holding her down. Thomas sat in his study, the fire burning low in the hearth, its light flickering across his face, casting long shadows that made his features look carved in stone. He had not spoken since the crowd dispersed. He had not eaten, not drank, not even blinked for what felt like hours. He simply stared at the empty chair across from him, the chair Evelyn used to sit in when she would bring him tea, ask about his work, or play the piano softly while he read. The memory twisted inside him like a knife. He told himself this was justice, that betrayal needed consequence, that he was restoring balance, but the longer he sat there, the more the silence began to hum in his head. Not peace, not satisfaction, but something else, something that sounded a lot like grief. Outside, the workers began their morning chores. No one dared to look toward the big house. The air was thick, heavy, a kind of quiet that made the smallest sound. A shovel scraping dirt, a horse snorting in the stable, echo louder than it should. Samuel moved slower than usual, his old bones aching more than they had in years. He couldn't shake the image of Evelyn kneeling, her voice breaking as she begged, her husband's face as still as stone. He had seen cruelty before. He had seen men lose themselves to rage, but what Thomas had done was colder. It wasn't madness, it was control, the kind of control that made the blood run cold. Grace came to him near the well, her face drawn tight. "He's not finished," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He told me this morning to call everyone again tonight." Samuel's stomach turned. "Again?" he asked. "What for?" Grace shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "He didn't say, but I heard him talking to the overseer. He said something about a reckoning before dawn." Samuel's hands tightened around the rope he was holding, his knuckles white. "God help us," he muttered. As the day dragged on, the sun hung like fire above the fields. The heat unbearable, yet no one complained. No one spoke more than a few words. Even the birds stayed quiet. Evelyn watched from her window, her eyes following the workers moving like ghosts through the fields. She felt the distance between them like a wall she could never cross. Once she had power, now she had only shame. And yet in her heart, a small spark of anger still lived. Not against Thomas, not against the people, but against herself for letting it all happen. She whispered Jacob's name under her breath again, wondering if he was still alive somewhere, if he had escaped, or if Thomas's silence about him meant something far worse. When the sun finally began to sink behind the trees, the air grew heavy again, thick with dread, the kind of quiet that comes before thunder. Grace moved through the quarters, her voice low. "He's calling for everyone," she said. "The courtyard again." The people looked at her with wide, frightened eyes, but they obeyed, because on the Caldwell plantation, there was no choice, only fear and the hope that obedience might be enough to survive. Evelyn was led out of her room by two servants, her face pale, her steps slow, her hair undone and falling over her shoulders. She looked like a ghost walking, her eyes fixed on the ground. When she reached the courtyard, she saw them all again. Every face, every torchlight, every whisper. Thomas stood waiting, his black coat buttoned to the collar, his expression unreadable. The night around them thick and breathless, he spoke without raising his voice. "Last night you all saw betrayal," he said, his tone even cold. "Tonight, you will see consequence." Evelyn's heart pounded. Her mouth dry, she opened her lips to speak, but no words came. Thomas gestured toward her, his voice steady. "For years, this woman sat above you. She gave orders, she carried pride, and when she betrayed me, she betrayed every one of you who lived under this roof." He paused, his eyes sweeping the crowd. "But I am not a man of cruelty, I am a man of order. And order requires justice." He turned to Samuel. "Tell them what I asked you to do." Samuel hesitated, his hands shaking. "Sir," he began, his voice trembling. Thomas's gaze cut through him like a blade. "Tell them," he repeated. Samuel swallowed hard, then spoke. He said, "She must stand where we once stood." His words came out barely above a whisper. "In the post yard." A shiver went through the crowd. The post yard was the place of punishment, where screams once echoed and blood once soaked the ground. Evelyn's knees weakened, her breath catching. "No," she whispered. "Thomas, please." He didn't answer, didn't even look at her. The people began to move slowly, reluctantly, forming a path toward the yard. The air smelled of sweat, dirt, and old memories. Evelyn stumbled forward, her tears blurring the torch's light. Samuel led her gently, whispering under his breath, "I'm sorry." "I'm so sorry," she didn't reply. She couldn't, her throat too tight. The crowd followed, their footsteps muffled in the soft dirt, the sky above them black and starless. When they reached the post, Evelyn stopped, staring at it with wide eyes. She had seen others tied there before. She had heard their cries. She had walked past them without pity, and now it stood before her like a mirror. She turned toward Thomas, her voice breaking. "You said you wanted peace," she cried. "Is this peace?" He met her eyes finally, his expression empty. "Peace requires truth," he said, and nodded to Samuel. The old man's hand shook as he tied the rope loosely around her wrists. She didn't fight, didn't struggle, only trembled as tears fell silently down her cheeks. The people stood watching, no one dared speak. The flames flickered against their faces, their eyes full of sorrow and fear. Thomas looked over them once more, his voice low. "You will not strike her," he said. "You will not harm her flesh," he paused. "But you will see her, you will not turn away. Not tonight." And with that he stepped back into the shadows. Evelyn stood there under the torchlight, her hair blowing softly in the night breeze, her white dress glowing faintly, her sobs quiet now. The people turned their faces away. Unable to watch, one by one they walked past her, each pausing for a heartbeat before lowering their eyes. Refusing to meet hers, it was not the whip that punished her. It was their silence, their turning away, their refusal to see her as human, and in that moment, she felt something inside her break completely. Samuel was the last to leave, his eyes wet, his voice low. "I'm sorry," he whispered again. "But he's right. This house had to see." Evelyn didn't answer. Her body shaking, her tears silent. The torches burned lower, the flames flickering out one by one until only a few remained. Thomas stood watching from the porch, his face hidden in shadow, and when the last torch died, he turned and walked inside without a word, leaving her in the dark, tied to the post beneath the endless black sky. The night stretched long and cruel, the wind whispering through the fields like voices of the dead. Evelyn lifted her head toward the sound, her lips trembling. "Forgive me," she whispered, to who she didn't know, and to Thomas, to God, to herself. And in the distance, thunder rumbled once again, soft and slow, like the heartbeat of a world that had grown tired of secrets and sorrow. When dawn finally broke, the first light touched her face. Pale and still, she was alive but empty. Her body weak, her soul hollowed out. Grace untied her quietly, her hands gentle, her eyes full of tears. "Come," she whispered. "It's over now." But Evelyn only shook her head, staring at the rising sun. "No," she said softly, "nothing's over. It's only beginning." And as she walked slowly back toward the house, her white dress dragging in the dirt, every eye turned away again, unable to bear the sight of the broken woman walking among them. A living ghost, a reminder of what happens when pride, love, and vengeance all share the same home. The night came heavy and slow over the Caldwell plantation, the sky hanging like a black curtain stretched too tight, the air thick enough to drown in. The fields whispered softly under the wind, but it was not the whisper of crops swaying. It was the whisper of memory, of things done that would not stay buried. The torches had burned out hours ago. The ground where Evelyn had stood still carried her footprints. Faint and lonely under the silver light of the moon, the world felt suspended between breath and confession. Thomas Caldwell sat alone in the parlor, a single candle burning on the table beside him. His coat still on, his hands clasped tight, his eyes staring at nothing. He could hear the faint ticking of the clock in the hall, every sound a reminder that time refused to stop for sorrow. He told himself he had done what was right, that justice had been served, that order had returned. Yet deep inside, a hollow ache began to grow, a space that words like pride and truth could no longer fill. He closed his eyes for a moment, but even behind his eyelids he could see her, the way she looked when the people turned away, the way her shoulders shook as she tried to speak, and the silence that followed her broken whisper. Upstairs, Evelyn lay awake in her bed, the moonlight spilling across the floor, painting everything in shades of silver and sorrow. She hadn't changed out of her torn gown, her hair spread across the pillow like tangled vines, her eyes open and wet staring at the ceiling. She could still feel the rope against her wrists, could still hear the hush of the crowd, the footsteps of people walking away from her one by one. She wondered if this was what death felt like, not pain, not fire, but emptiness so deep it swallowed every sound. She turned her face to the wall, pressing her cheek against the cold wood, listening to the faint creak of the house. Every sound alive, breathing, judging. She whispered softly, "Thomas." But her voice vanished in the air. Outside, the plantation was still, the cabins dark. No laughter, no singing. Even the dogs refused to bark. Samuel sat on the steps of his small cabin, his elbows on his knees, staring out toward the big house. A pipe in his hand he didn't bother to light. He had seen too much in his lifetime, but never silence like this. It was the kind of quiet that made a man hear things that weren't there, the sound of chains that no longer clinked, the sob of a child long gone, the whisper of ghosts that never left. Grace came out behind him, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders. "You can feel it too," she said softly. Her voice almost breaking. Samuel nodded, his eyes still fixed on the house. "He broke her," he whispered. And it broke him too. In the great hall, the grandfather clock struck midnight. The sound rolling through the rooms like a warning. Evelyn sat up, her heart beating faster. The candle on her table flickered suddenly. Though there was no wind, she could smell the faint scent of smoke, not from the candle but something older, deeper, the same smell that clung to the courtyard. She rose slowly, her bare feet cold on the floor, and opened her door. The hallway stretched long and dark, shadows crawling over the walls, the silence so complete it felt alive. She walked down the corridor, the floorboards creaking softly beneath her, every step echoing like a confession. When she reached the top of the stairs, she saw it. A faint glow from the parlor below. The light of the single candle Thomas had left burning. He was still sitting there, his head bowed, his face hidden in his hands. She stood for a long time watching him from the shadows, torn between fear and longing. The man who had once held her hand now looked like a stranger carved out of grief. She wanted to go to him, to beg, to scream, to touch his shoulder, but something in her heart told her it was too late. She turned to leave, but the floor creaked beneath her foot, and Thomas looked up sharply. Their eyes met across the dark stairwell, his face pale under the candlelight, her breath caught. Neither spoke. For a moment the world stood still. Then he said quietly, "You should be sleeping," his voice low and tired. She swallowed hard, her words trembling. "I can't," she said. "I keep hearing things." He stared at her for a moment, then looked away. "So do I," he murmured, and the way he said it made her chest ache. She descended slowly, her hand brushing the banister, the air between them heavy. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, a few steps away from him. "Thomas," she whispered, her voice soft. "What happens now?" He looked at her with eyes hollow as the night. "Now we live with what we've done," he said simply. She wanted to tell him he had gone too far, that she had been punished enough, that the people would never look at them the same again, but the words wouldn't form, because deep down she knew he wasn't talking only about her. He was talking about himself too. For a long time they sat there, two souls bound by silence, the candle burning lower, the shadows on the wall stretching longer. When the flame finally sputtered out, Evelyn stood, her face barely visible in the pale moonlight. "You think this will bring you peace," she said softly. "But it won't." He looked up, his voice flat. "Peace isn't for people like us." She turned and walked back up the stairs, her white dress trailing behind her. The house groaned quietly as if it could feel every step. When she reached her room, she didn't close the door. She just stood by the window, staring out at the fields that shimmered under the moon. Out in the distance, thunder rolled once more. Soft and low, Samuel lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Storm's coming again," he said. Grace nodded, her hands clasped tight. "Maybe the Lord's trying to wash this place clean," she whispered. Samuel shook his head slowly. "Some stains don't wash off." Inside the house, Thomas returned to his study. The fire had long died out, but he sat there anyway, staring at the ashes, the faint smell of smoke rising from the embers. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the small gold button he had found by the stable, the one that had started everything. He turned it over in his hand, the light catching it faintly, and for the first time since the night he had walked into that barn, a tear slipped down his cheek. It wasn't for his wife or for himself, but for the life he had destroyed trying to protect something that had already been gone. He placed the button on the desk, staring at it like a confession carved in gold, and whispered, "Let it end, upstairs." Evelyn finally closed her eyes, but sleep did not come. The air around her seemed to move, soft whispers filling the corners of the room. She thought she heard footsteps outside her door. Slow, deliberate, she sat up, her breath catching. "Thomas," she called softly, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped. The house went still again, and she felt the chill crawl down her spine. She lay back slowly, her heart racing, the whispers fading into the sound of the rain beginning to fall, gentle at first, then harder. The storm breaking open once more, the wind howling against the windows like the cry of something that had been waiting too long to be heard. Through the storm, the house stood strong, but something inside it had shifted. The walls seemed to hum, the floors to sigh, as if every beam and nail now carried the memory of what had happened. And in that long, endless night, no one spoke again, not Thomas, not Evelyn, not Samuel or Grace. The plantation slept but did not rest, the air thick with sorrow and ghosts. When morning came, the sky was gray again, the rain still falling in thin sheets, washing the dirt from the courtyard, the post standing dark and wet in the middle, the rope gone but its mark still there. Evelyn watched it from her window, her hand pressed to the glass, her eyes hollow but dry. She whispered quietly, "Let it end." And the echo of her words drifted down through the empty halls to where Thomas sat below, whispering the same words to the same silent air, and for a brief moment the house seemed to breathe again, tired, wounded, but alive. And though the rain washed away the footprints, and the sun eventually rose to dry the earth, the silence of that night never left the Caldwell plantation. It lingered in the corners, in the fields, in the dreams of every soul who had stood beneath that moon and watched justice turn into something darker, quieter, something that could no longer be undone. Years passed, but the Caldwell plantation never healed. The soil still grew cotton, the sun still burned over the fields, but the laughter that once echoed between the trees had died long ago. People in town whispered about that house on the hill, the white one with the cracked shutters and the broken gate. They said it was cursed, that no songbird ever landed there again, that every night when the wind blew through the valley, it carried the sound of a woman crying softly, her voice rising and falling like the hum of the fields themselves. They called it the Mourning House. Though everyone still knew its name, they still whispered it in Caldwell. A name that once meant power now meant warning. Thomas Caldwell grew older but never gentler. His hair turned gray, his hands rough, his eyes dull. He spoke little, ate little, and spent most of his days wandering the edge of the fields where the stable once stood. He never remarried, never left the land. Some said he couldn't, as if the house itself refused to let him go. He walked with the same slow, heavy steps every day, stopping by the post yard, staring at the empty ground for hours, then turning back without a word. The people who worked for him spoke in low tones, afraid of the silence more than his anger, because the master's rage had died, and what replaced it was far worse. It was quiet. Endless and cold. Evelyn changed too. She no longer dressed in white or wore jewels. Her beauty faded like paint left in the sun. She moved through the house like a ghost, her voice small, her presence softer each day. She rarely left her room. She played the piano sometimes in the evenings, the same melody over and over again, slow and mournful, until even the servants begged her to stop because it made the air feel colder. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The song seemed to be the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Sometimes Thomas would stand outside her door listening, his face unreadable, then walk away before she finished. One stormy night years later, Grace came running from the quarters, rain pouring down her shawl. She banged on the great door until Samuel opened it, his old eyes wide. "The mistress," she gasped. "She's gone." Samuel's heart sank. They searched the house first, her room empty, the window open, the curtains blowing in the wind like pale ghosts. Thomas didn't speak. He simply took a lantern and stepped into the rain. The others followed him to the edge of the field, their boots sinking into the wet mud. The night was thick with mist, and through it faintly came the sound of the piano, not from the house but from the old barn, soft and slow, carried by the wind. Thomas walked ahead, the lantern swaying, his face wet not just from rain but from sweat, or maybe tears. No one could tell. When he reached the barn, the door creaked open under his hand. Inside it was dark except for the faint light of the lantern, and in the middle of the room stood Evelyn, her gown soaked through, her hair hanging over her face. She was playing something on the old piano that had been left to rot there, her fingers trembling over the keys, her voice humming the same tune she'd played every night for years. Thomas stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak. Finally, he said her name softly. "Evelyn." She stopped playing but didn't look at him. She whispered something barely audible. "I wanted to see him." He frowned, stepping closer. "Who?" he asked. But when she lifted her head, her eyes were filled with tears. "Jacob," she said. "He's still here." Thomas felt a chill crawl up his spine, the air inside the barn suddenly colder. He turned to look behind him but saw nothing. When he looked back at her, she was standing, her face pale in the lantern light. "You hear them too, don't you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "At night, when the wind moves through the fields, you hear them calling." Thomas said nothing, his hands shaking. "They never left." "Thomas," she said. "None of them did, not Jacob. Not the ones we broke, not the ones who watched." She stepped closer, her eyes wide and shining. "They're still here," she whispered. "And they're waiting for us." Lightning flashed through the cracks in the wood, the thunder rolling so close it shook the floor. Evelyn turned away from him, walking toward the open door, her dress dragging through the mud. Thomas called her name again, but his voice broke. She stepped into the rain and disappeared into the darkness. Samuel and Grace found him there hours later. Still standing, the lantern burned out, the barn empty, only the faint echo of the piano lingering in the air. Evelyn was never found the next morning. The storm had washed the fields clean. No footprints, no sign of her, only the faint smell of her rose perfume near the old post yard. After that night, the plantation began to wither. Not all at once, but piece by piece. Workers left quietly, one after another. Crops failed for reasons no one could explain. The animals grew restless, spooked by shadows that no one could see. Thomas stayed alone in the big house. Refusing to leave, he spoke to no one, ate almost nothing, Some nights the people in town said they saw lights flickering in the windows long after midnight, and sometimes, when the wind was just right, they said they heard two voices, one deep and broken, the other soft and distant, like a woman singing through tears. Years later, when Thomas Caldwell finally died, they found him sitting in his chair in the parlor, the same spot he always sat, his eyes open, a faint smile on his lips, and beside him on the desk was that same gold button, shining faintly in the morning light. The servants buried him on the hill beside the house. No priest came, no family remained, only Samuel and Grace stood by the grave. The rain beginning to fall again, soft and steady. Grace whispered a prayer for his soul, but Samuel said nothing. He only looked toward the house and muttered, "He'll never leave it." And he was right, because after Thomas was gone, the new owners who tried to live there never lasted long. One by one they left, claiming to hear footsteps on the stairs, the piano playing in the night, doors opening and closing by themselves. Some swore they saw a woman in white standing by the window, staring out at the fields, her hair blowing though there was no wind. Others said they saw a man sitting on the porch, silent, his face turned toward the barn, waiting. The locals stopped going near the place after sundown, and travelers passing through would ask about the house, pointing to its shadow on the hill, and the old folks in town would just shake their heads and say, "That's Caldwell's land, don't go near it after dark." And so the years kept turning, the earth swallowing the past bit by bit. But the whispers never died on quiet nights. When the wind moved through the cotton, it carried their names, Thomas, Evelyn, Jacob, their voices tangled together like roots under the soil. No longer love, no longer hate, just memory. And those who listened long enough said they could still hear the piano faintly, the same sad song played on an instrument that should have fallen silent decades ago. Now only the ruins remain, the house broken, the roof caved in, the walls cracked and covered in vines, the fields overgrown, the air heavy with ghosts. And when the sun sets over that part of Alabama, the light hits the land just right. The shadows stretch long, and for a moment, it looks as if someone is standing on the porch again. A man in an old black coat, his face turned toward the barn, waiting for someone who never comes, and beside him, if you look long enough, you might see a woman in white, her hair blowing, her head bowed, her hands reaching for forgiveness that will never arrive. And when the wind passes through the grass, it still carries that same sound, faint and sorrowful, a whisper born from the soil of the Caldwell plantation. A whisper that says, some sins don't die. They only wait, and every soul that ever walked this cursed ground still walks it now, bound to the house that once promised them forever, and delivered them only silence.